Hey, everybody, it's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show, as always, brought to you by the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine. Hey, here it is. Here's the latest issue on culture wars. Yes, censorship, culture, cancel culture, and so on has reached the realm of science and science magazines, except for Skeptic. You can pick us up at any fine bookstore. We're carried pretty much in every bookstore in North America. You can go to skeptic.com/magazine and order your subscription, or you can get back issues all the way back to 1992 when we founded the magazine and started with Isaac Asimov on our cover, who had just died then. If you want to support the society, we are a 501c3. You can go to skeptic.com/donate. All right. My guest today is Yuval Levin, the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where he holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he's also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. His previous books include The Fractured Republic. Oh boy, he's going to have to do an update on that one. Well, he did because he has a new book out. And his other book is called A Time to Build. Here's the new book, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. And oh boy, do we ever need that. Yuval, nice to see you. You're the perfect guest for this week. Oh my God. This has been
thank
a
you very
crazy
much for
week.
having me, Michael.
You must be describing The Fractured Republic. When was that? That was like 8 years ago you wrote that book?
Yeah, that was in 2016, and it sure hasn't gotten better. So maybe I should stop writing these books. They seem to be self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yeah, Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman coined the term, the problem of the availability heuristic or the availability bias. It is, we tend to assess things based on what's most readily available in the news and in our own world or whatever. So if you ask people, what are you most afraid of? It's, shark attacks and killer bees and terrorists, not heart disease or diabetes or whatever. But applied to this problem, it certainly feels like we've never been so divided. But, I'm old enough to remember, the Watergate and Nixon and the Vietnam War, and I barely missed the draft. It was pretty crazy back then. Is it just seems this way because of the recency effect and the availability heuristic, or is there some objective measures we can say it's really worse?
I think it's a very important question. I certainly wouldn't say we've never been so divided, right? This is a country that has fought a civil war. It's a country that's been through very, very dark times together. I do think that we went through a long stretch from the end of the real madness of the 1960s, early 70s, until the 21st century, when we did have an unusual kind of consensus politics in American life for a while. I didn't always feel that way in the moment. Obviously, politics is always divided. But we had very low levels of political violence for a long time in America after going through a period of very, very high levels. And broadly speaking, American politics was, in fact, less divided, say, 30 years ago than it is now. I think part of what that means is that we're back to a kind of norm of political discord that Americans in the 19th century would have recognized, but that we're not used to. And that does matter. The fact that people 120 years ago would have known how to live in this moment doesn't help us that much. It does suggest our system has strong institutions, that we can survive this, but exactly how and how to respond to it day by day, and also, I think, how to sustain a sense of reality, how to distinguish what is true from what is false. And of course, you've had so much to say about this that's been so important. I think it's very difficult now, because one of the ways in which this moment is different is that we're experiencing it through social media and through various digital technologies that really are new, and that we are only learning to live with. And it can be very difficult, I think, to make use of some of the tools we have for dealing with division and difference, a lot of which are basically tools that let us say, well, those people are going to do that over there, but we live here, and we can live this way. Now everything's in front of you, everything's on your phone, everything's in your face all the time. And I do think we have to relearn some skills that are necessary for the liberal society, even if America has been divided this way before.
Yeah. A couple of my favorite quotes here from John Stuart Mill in 1859 on liberty. A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. That seems to explain a lot why we have a two-party system. Even if we have multiple parties, they still kind of cluster left and right.
Definitely. I mean, that's been a central theme of my own work for a long time, too, very much influenced by Mill and by Burke and others who tend to think that our politics is really divided over how change should happen. And in that sense, a party that thinks in terms of advancing toward justice and a party that thinks in terms of protecting social order really do define our politics. But there are times when they're more intensely divided than others, and it certainly does feel uniquely polarized now, at least for in living memory.
Yeah. I'm going to get into the details of the Constitution in your book in a moment. One more quote here from your late colleague, Charles Krauthammer. He wrote this in 2013 in his book, Things That Matter. Politics, the crooked timber of our communal lives, dominates everything because in the end, everything, high and low, and most especially high, lives or dies by politics. You can have the most advanced and efflorescent of cultures. Get your politics wrong, however, and everything stands to be swept away. That feels rather prescient right now.
Yeah, I think what's really important about that view is that it sees politics as setting the preconditions for a free society. It doesn't determine everything, it doesn't answer every question, but it's a necessary precursor to a society in which we can make our own decisions. And in the absence of a functional politics, it's really impossible for anything else to work. So I would say politics doesn't set the answers to the highest questions we have and the most important things in our lives. But if we don't have a functional social order, a way of resolving disputes that doesn't require us to turn to force and coercion, then we can't do anything else. And that is really ultimately why a working politics has to be there before we can have a thriving society.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Krauthammer, George Will, yourself, these are some of my favorite conservative writers on that premise. I'm not technically a conservative, more of a classical liberal, but I think we need both positions. So before we get into how that was all set up by the founders, just comments on current events. I sent you my little piece, Conspiracy or Incompetence. I tend to go with incompetence when it comes to government.
Me too.
Assassination attempt of Trump. What are your thoughts on how that's going to unfold?
I'm with you on that, and I would say for me, that's really a function of my own experience in government. I spent a lot of time working in government. I worked for a Speaker of the House, for Newt Gingrich in his last few years as Speaker. I worked for a President of the United States. I was a White House staffer for 4 years. And one of the things you learn in those jobs is that ultimately no one is fully in charge of anything. And the world is very, very complex. I'll tell you a quick story about the first time I really encountered this. I was a very junior staffer in Newt Gingrich's office during the Clinton impeachment in 1997. I would ride into work on the Metro and read in the Washington Post how Republican leaders had all these plans and they were going to pull things this way and that way. And then I'd get to work, and to say that no one had a plan would be a gross understatement. No one had any idea what was going to happen that afternoon. And over, I encountered this. I worked in the Bush White House during the Katrina response. I was very involved in it. And the constant sense we had was, this is just overwhelming our capacity to plan and make decisions. And I think big events are always like that. The idea that in a free society, somebody is pulling the strings and someone has a 9-step plan and you're just a pawn in it, that's just very, very implausible. Our society doesn't really work that way. Our elites now are not ultra competent. You can say a lot of things about them, but I would not say that we have ultra competent leaders of any institution. And so the idea that, it's all a false flag and a plan, I can see the appeal of wanting to believe that somebody's in charge of everything. But when you actually see the system work, it's both good news and bad news, but nobody's in charge of everything. Nobody is using you as a pawn, but at the same time, no one's in charge. So it's very hard to control events. They just kind of come at you. I'm always inclined to assume incompetence over malevolence. Obviously, there are exceptions, but in our free society, they are very rare.
Yeah. Well, the assassination of Lincoln was a conspiracy, but they knew that within hours and had captured the assassins and so on. And it was quite clear what the motive was and so on. With JFK, I'm going with the lone assassin, but the appeal that, this was by the CIA because of Vietnam War and he wanted to end it, all these, Oliver Stone has, like 200 steps that would have to be done just perfectly executed. Everyone's at the right spot at the right time and all. That's just not how it works.
Exactly. It's so unlikely. I think there's a natural tendency when people see a big event to think that somebody must have intended it. I mean, that's just a natural way to think. Or when something unexpected or unpleasant happens. I would say, when you lose a close election, as both parties have in the 21st century, there's always a tendency to think, well, somebody did this. This didn't really happen. And you always find the other side's conspiracy really strange. I mean, the Russian manipulation of Facebook, or the idea that the state attorneys general and state secretaries of state got together in Georgia and Pennsylvania and planned this. To outsiders, it just looks ridiculous. To people who kind of fall for it, and I don't need to tell you this, you know this better than literally anybody, but the appeal of connecting the dots is so powerful that it can often be irresistible, and I think we're all prone to it. Very intelligent people will find themselves falling into this way of thinking if they're not careful.
Yeah. I had Garrett Graff on the podcast about his book about UFOs and UAPs, and the government has been hiding all this for 75 years. So he was telling me about his new book, which just came out on D-Day. He said, this was like the most secret plan ever by the U.S. government, short of maybe the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. And then he rattled off all the leaks. Like some guy accidentally mailed the invasion plans to his mother. Another guy left the invasion plans on the bus and had to chase the bus down the street to get it. He goes, there was a bunch of things like that. Mm-hmm. Just screw-ups.
People are people, right? I mean, would you be able to pull that off? I certainly wouldn't. And,
no.
It's human beings all the way down.
Yeah, and also, we expect the Secret Service should have done this or that. Well, I have no idea what you're supposed to do. And supposedly they're trained, but, maybe when actual guns are flying, like Mike Tyson says, the moment you get punched in the face, all your training and plans goes out the window. You just don't know.
This is the thing, there's a danger in a moment like this of everybody suddenly becoming an expert in presidential security. And right. you just have to say, right. I don't know. I have no idea how to do this. And the Secret Service has averted presidential assassinations for 61 years now. Maybe they do know how to do this. Yeah. Obviously, nobody does anything perfectly, but let's not pretend we're all experts in this just because we're on Twitter.
That's a great line. It's like after 9/11, everybody was an expert on how buildings fall. Oh, really? Right. I really have no idea how buildings fall. That's so funny. Okay. Before the Trump assassination attempt, Wall Street Journal had that survey showing that the majority of Americans want neither candidate in the election, and the response by the candidates in the party seems to be, well, too bad. That's the way it works. This is what you got. Why is there not something like the manager in baseball that goes out to the mound and says, "You're done, son"? And he goes, "No, coach, leave me in. I can get the guy out." "No, you can't. You're out." Or, a board of directors like Apple. They fired Steve Jobs. Oh, my God. Well, somebody has to step in, and be the adult in the room. Yeah. How come there's nothing like that with the, in this case, the Democratic Party?
It's a very interesting story, and it points to the history of the American party system. The parties really exist to be, in essence, repositories of political professionalism. Democracy, broadly speaking, is an amateur sport. It's not about professionalism. It's about hearing from everyone. But at the core of it, to facilitate it and to enable collective action, we've always had, almost always, since just about the very beginning of American political life, political parties that functioned as collections of professionals who did make decisions like this. And their decisions are especially about who to nominate, right? Candidate selection has, for most of our history, been a function of party professionals, and it's easy to caricature them. They literally did meet in smoky back rooms and make deals and decisions. But the work they did ultimately made American democracy functional, made American democracy possible. And we've always had just about two parties. The American system stands out for this, in part because of how we select presidents. The Electoral College requires that someone win an absolute majority of electors, which means if you have more than two serious candidates, the election might go to the House, and nobody really wants that. And so for a very long time, we've had two essentially professional party organizations. Since about the beginning of the 1960s, the parties were under pressure to democratize their internal operations. The back room started to strike people as illegitimate, and the idea was let members of the party vote on who the nominees should be for president, but also for members of Congress, for governor, for everything. And that democratization, which I think made sense to a lot of people as a practical matter at the time, has had an unintended effect, a largely unintended effect, of essentially turning the core function of the political parties over to more or less a random electorate. I mean, if you think about it, people who show up to vote on primary day are just whoever's able to do it, or interested enough, or engaged enough. In some states, in my state, you don't even have to be a member of the party to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary. And so the parties have rented out their core function to an essentially random outside electorate. And what's ended up happening, and this really wasn't predicted, is that those people who vote in primaries are actually the Americans who are least interested in seeing our politics function as an arena for negotiation and bargaining and accommodation. They're the most partisan people in both parties. And so they want ideological purity. And so now we begin every election cycle by asking essentially the craziest people in America, who do you want to be running for every office in our politics? And the result is what we get. The result is, among other things, unpopular candidates for a lot of offices. People who are not well equipped to win the general election, because the general election electorate does want a functional politics of people who are at least temperamentally moderate, people who are capable of negotiating with each other, people who represent them in attractive ways. The tension, the difference between the primary electorate and the general electorate has been very bad for the parties. And in fact, we've now lived through 30 years or so in which we haven't really had a majority party in America. Both parties are failing simultaneously, which is very unusual in our politics. When they win an election, they win it barely, a narrow, tiny majority. And the party that loses generally doesn't learn anything from its loss. It doesn't change what it's doing. It just does the same thing next time. And things are so close that they might even win by doing the same thing next time. We're watching that happen now. The Republican Party is running again, the candidate who lost last time, and there's every reason to think he might win this time. That is a dysfunctional party politics. It's a system that is not able to learn lessons from its own failures and convey signals to the people in it. And among the most significant effects of that is that there is this passivity, this loss of a self-conscious elite in both parties. And everybody just says, well, isn't anybody going to do something? You know, Joe Biden seems like he's too old to run, and isn't anybody going to tell him? And you think, well, I don't know, you're the Speaker of the House. You're a leader of the Democratic Party. Maybe you should tell him. Nobody feels like they're actors in this moment. Everybody feels like they're observers. And that passivity, which I think is very characteristic now of 21st century American life, where everything has become a kind of performance rather than activity, contributes a lot to the dysfunction of both parties. I would say we're in a moment when party elites in both parties are declining, refusing to tell the public what they think of their party's nominee. There are a lot of Republicans who have a kind of private view of Donald Trump that they do not share. There are a lot of Democrats, it turns out, who have a sense about Joe Biden that they will not just come out and say. And maybe they'll now feel enough pressure to say it because it looks like they could pay a big price if they don't. But the fact that we're in this situation with two extremely unpopular people running against each other for president is an example of the failure of the party system that we really have to learn from and think about what kinds of reforms might get us out of this rut.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Trump, denouncing him has, direct negative consequences for people's political career. He just, primaries them or whatever. Liz Cheney's career was over the moment she went down that path. It doesn't seem like Biden would do something like that, but maybe it's more indirect and subtle than Trump.
I think there's just a kind of team spirit sense here that if you criticize Biden, you help Trump. And nobody wants to be the person responsible for undermining their own party's prospects. The trouble is, ultimately, this has to be somebody's job, somebody's role that, we are party insiders. And I think part of what has happened in our political culture in this century is that everybody wants to be the outsider. Everybody wants to be the observer criticizing the elite. And nobody's willing to say, I am the elite. I am the insider. I'm the person who makes these decisions. There's upsides to that and downsides. And I think the absence of that willingness to take on the role is evident throughout our political life. It's evident in the work of Congress in general. It's evident in many ways in the executive branch, where we have presidents who take themselves to be critics of the government rather than obviously embodying the work of the government. I think we see that in a lot of institutions outside of politics, too. It's a kind of characteristic problem of our time.
Yeah. I was looking up the Reagan-Mondale score there because everybody's bringing that up. Trump could win in a landslide now if they leave Biden in. And although he did win all but two states, he got 58% of the vote. So Mondale still got 42% of the vote, even though he's completely landslided. So that's people are just voting by their team mostly.
I think it's right. I mean, there is certainly just a kind of party identity that's pretty strong, even in moments like that. But we have a system that among its virtues, in my view, tends to magnify election victories. The Electoral College, once you have a majority, a meaningful majority, 58% is a pretty good majority. It's a very clear election win. The Electoral College magnifies that in a way that really turns it into a persuasive landslide. Ronald Reagan won 49 states, right? He lost Minnesota and the District of Columbia. That's a dramatic win of a sort that's very unusual in our politics. And yet, as you say, he didn't win 90% of the vote. He didn't even win 60% of the vote. I think on the whole, that's a good thing. But what we've seen in the 21st century is nobody comes close to that because our elections really are genuinely very close. House majorities now are in the single digits. It's the second Congress in a row where we've had a House majority below 5 seats. That's extremely unusual, and it really is a 50-50 politics that has great trouble functioning.
When you see somebody like the head of the Teamsters speaking at the RNC this week, is that kind of a Machiavellian, like we're just hoping to get their votes, or is the Republican Party really shifting more toward the working class?
I think there's a little bit of both. These things always happen in both directions, I would say. A party reaches out to voters to try to win them, but as a result, it also changes its own character and its own agenda. I think the Republican electorate has, in fact, become a more working class electorate over the course of the past 20 years. The Democratic electorate has become a more white-collar, college-educated electorate. And the two parties naturally will shift gradually to serve their actual voters. And so I do think there's some genuine willingness to think in terms of a working class agenda. Mostly Republicans have done that so far in terms of cultural appeals rather than economic policy. But I think there are some people in the party, one of them has just been selected to be the vice presidential nominee, who do want to see real change in the party's economic appeal. And over time, that may well happen.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of equating Trump with Hitler and all that stuff, maybe that's part of the rhetoric. If you, have 0.001% of mentally ill, deranged people in a population of 340, somebody's going to take that seriously, like this Crooks kid. But, I think the larger problem is, trying to convince people that Trump really would ruin the country. All my liberal friends and even some of my conservative friends are more like old school, never Trumper type Republicans. Say, he could ruin this be our last election. He could ruin the country. How would he do that exactly? I mean, even not being a Trump fan, I fail to see he doesn't control the military. I mean, to have a coup in which you end elections and democracy and you take over a country. I mean, we see how this is done in other countries. You have to have the military. You have to have the courts. You have to control the press and end the media completely. How would that ever happen under Trump?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Trump's either, but I agree with you. I think we have strong institutions in America, and there's a limit to what anybody can do, even if that person is the president of the United States. We saw that last time. Look, Donald Trump has already been president, and he certainly did do some terrible things with regard to our constitutional order. He tried to deny the results of an election, and he encouraged, I would say, a group of people who wanted to disrupt the certification of that election. But it didn't work, and that is important to see. There is reason to have some confidence in our institutions. The Congress continued to count the votes, including the House, which had a pro-Trump Republican majority. They continued to do their work. The courts worked, and the Trump administration never refused to enforce a court order. I think if they did that, there would be serious problems. But ultimately, the institutions would assert themselves as they have. The military showed itself to be independent and ultimately, obviously, always subject to civilian control, but not subject to political pressures. So there are reasons to worry. I do think there are ways in which Donald Trump is not aware enough of the significance of the constraints on his power in our system and is not respectful enough of those limits. But I don't think fundamentally that the way to think about Trump is as an authoritarian. And I don't think the rest of our system is inclined in the direction of letting him be an authoritarian. Look, it's worth worrying. I mean, I could be wrong, right? We should always be prepared for the possibility of real dangers to our constitutional system. But that system is well prepared for dangerous people, and I think we should be grateful for that, and for the independence of the institutions from each other, so that the courts, even though some of the judges on the Supreme Court were appointed by Donald Trump, they've been perfectly willing to say no to him on very important subjects. They seem to be actually trying to apply the law. Congress, Trump was impeached twice, and I do think there's a willingness in the institution to do its fundamental job. So I wouldn't say I'm not worried. I don't think Donald Trump is the kind of person who ought to be president. But I also think we have a system that is reasonably well equipped to withstand the kind of pressure that he can produce, and that there's a limit to that pressure.
Yeah. Along the team sport aspect, I do a lot of God debates and debates about religion and whatnot. So I've done a number of these, like with Dinesh D'Souza, for example, at a church during the Trump administration. So I asked, how can you guys support this guy? I mean, he's not really, the conservative Christian that you guys are. We're the party of family and values. Like, yeah, okay, this guy. So their answer was basically, well, first, of course, they're all pro-life, so he's going to get us the judges we want, and he did. Okay. And that God works in mysterious ways. Look at the characters in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Pretty morally questionable characters. But, they did God's bidding and they delivered the message they needed to or whatever. It's like, that's how it works. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe
I think that's a kind of begging of the question. I mean, that presumes that what he's doing is God's will or whatever it is you want to take it to be. I just think that's such a bizarre way to think about this particular individual. I have been very surprised by the intensity of the team spirit in this mode. I've been in and around politics for a long time. There's always a willingness to criticize your own party's leaders when they stray from your views. That's how party politics works. Parties are a coalition, and people are generally very willing to say, well, I'm more of a Republican than the president. I wish he were, sticking to principle. Somehow when it comes to Donald Trump, I think there's some kind of defensiveness about him. People who've persuaded themselves to vote for him, even though they know that he has profound problems as a human being, then have to persuade themselves and others that there's nothing wrong with him, that he's just an ideal figure to be president. And look, I think voters face a tough choice, and maybe this is the choice they needed to make, but at least be honest with yourself about who this person is and what his limitations are. Character matters enormously in the President of the United States. This is an institution that consists fundamentally of one person, unlike our other institutions. And that means that we have to take personal character seriously. And I just don't see how you can deny that there are tremendous problems of personal character with Donald Trump. I mean, for God's sake, even if you vote for him, at least be honest about that.
Yeah. So I was just at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas last weekend. This is kind of the big libertarian, sort of conservative, and all the candidates were there. Libertarian and Jill Stein with the Green Party, Randall Terry with the Constitution Party, and RFKJ was there. And boy, massive difference in security. None of those other people had any security at all. They're just walking around. People didn't even know who they were. But RFK, hours before, there were armed guards and dogs, German shepherds sniffing everything, and metal detectors, the whole thing. I was hoping to meet him in the green room and give him a copy of my conspiracy book because he could use that.
He really could.
But it was not to be. No, he came in some secret entrance and left. Just no, for obvious reasons now, I guess.
Yeah.
But why those people have no chance? How come we can't be like Germany, where there's 4 or 5 viable parties? No one has a majority. Explain the kind of institutional structure and constitutional setup for why we end up with 2.
So it's true. The United States has almost from the very beginning had 2 parties. And part of the reason for that is structural and constitutional. We have an unusual way of selecting the president in the United States. It's done through the Electoral College. I think I think the Electoral College is ultimately a good institution, and I would defend it. This is not a time when many people do that, but I do. But one of the peculiar things about the Electoral College is that among its rules are that in order to be elected president, you have to win an absolute majority of electors, which means that if there are more than 2 serious candidates for president, there's a very high risk that the election will go to the House of Representatives, which is what happens if the Electoral College can't reach a majority for anyone. And from the very beginning, when there have been more than 2 serious candidates, that has been a risk. And it happened twice. It happened in 1800 and in 1824. Those were both just tremendous legitimacy crises, especially 1824, where there were 4 candidates. No one came close to winning. And ultimately, the House chose the person who came in second, both in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. And it was called the corrupt bargain. It was, the House didn't want Andrew Jackson to be president, so they made John Quincy Adams president, and it created enormous problems. And from that moment, really, I would say under the leadership of Martin Van Buren, who's an underappreciated figure in our history, the party system took shape as a two-party system. And what a two-party system means is that a lot of the kinds of differences that happen between the parties in the parliamentary systems of Europe happen within the parties in the United States. Our two parties are coalitions. They're pretty big tents. They're pretty broad coalitions. I think they are recognizably left and right. They represent a kind of general tendency that makes some sense, but very often they contain factions that have big differences with each other, and those have to be worked out. I think broadly speaking, this has been good for us. The two-party system is a good fit for the American system of government because of the presidency. Again, the president is a kind of singular office, and it would be hard for a president to represent a coalition of parties. And so it makes a little sense. I think Congress also tends to work better because of the two-party system, but that's the case when the two-party system is working well. And I think in the 21st century, that system has run aground for reasons we've talked about. And I think that part of what that's left us with is an inability to build internal coalitions within the party, an inability, therefore, to negotiate across party lines, and the knack for building coalitions, which is the central and important skill in our political system, has really been degraded in the 21st century, so that it's harder inside the party to build broad coalitions, and parties don't win big election victories. It's harder in Congress to build broad coalitions, and you see much less cross-partisan legislative work being done. And part of what we need to recover, in a sense, is a way for people to work together when they don't agree about everything. In a sense, people say we've forgotten how to agree in American life. We're so divided. I actually think we're very good at agreeing. We're really good at agreeing with people we agree with. It's all we ever do. We just spend all our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. What we're not good at is disagreeing. We don't know how to actually disagree with someone directly. We spend very little time, even people who are very active in politics, spend very little time in direct engagement with people they disagree with. And we don't know how to negotiate, how to bargain, how to build coalitions. Those skills are crucial, and they have to be recovered. I think a lot of the venues for coalition building, the places where debate really happens, not just Congress, although that's key, but even the university, open forums for public engagement and debate, have really been degraded in American life in our time. And to recover them, we have to relearn the skills of disagreement that points ultimately toward negotiated action. That's what cohesion actually looks like in a free society.
So that would explain why when the Republican Speaker of the Houses try to make deals, they get hammered by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene as being traitors.
The argument against them is you made a deal with the Democrats over the budget. Well, that's literally his job description. And it's yours too, to Marjorie Taylor Greene and the people who are throwing him out. A lot of younger members of Congress now in particular don't see negotiation as their job. But the Constitution does. It is their job. And I think to recover that requires changing some of the incentives that they confront, which right now really point them away from bargaining and deal-making, coalition building.
Yeah. Okay, last question on current events. So in the convention next month for the Democrats, there's not likely to be one of these backroom smoke-filled deals where Biden is out and somebody else steps up and then the party gets behind them. That's not likely to happen.
I think that's right, but it is entirely possible that by then Biden is not the nominee. I think that for that to happen, he would have to decide to step down. And obviously, he doesn't seem inclined that way.
He's pretty stubborn.
Yeah, he sure is. And I think he's probably being misinformed about public opinion at this point and maybe doesn't have a clear sense of his own limitations. That's always hard to have. I think if they do end up with a different nominee, it will be because he has decided or agreed to step down. I don't think the party can make him do it. There's not a mechanism for it. He did win the primaries, and that is their official mechanism for candidate selection. So that if he really insists, there basically is no way for them to do it within their rules, and I don't see them changing the rules. I just don't think there's a consensus for that. And again, The party just barely exists. You say the Democrats should do this or that. I don't know who we're talking about anymore. The Democrats, as the Democrats, don't really exist, and the same for the Republicans.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. The hero of your book is James Madison. I love him. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Madison. By the way, a few years ago, just for fun, because I like to listen to audiobooks, I listened to the entire Federalist Papers on audio. It's free.
Wow.
Get it on audible.com. Yeah. It's just stunning what geniuses these guys were. And along the lines of, 340 million Americans, we got these two guys. I always wondered if the James Madison level intellects, Jefferson, Hamilton, and so on, maybe they don't go into politics anymore because it's such a dirty business. Maybe they go into finance. I think
there's a lot of truth to that, actually. There's a way now, I think, that a certain kind of ambition and ability is drawn elsewhere, is drawn to the business world, is drawn into other places, media, but there's less of it in politics because politics seems somehow less appealing or less of a venue for that kind of ambition. There is something amazing about that moment of the American founding that drew out tremendous talent in this really backwater place. I mean, the American colonies in the 1770s and 80s, they were at the edge of the world. And these people had very little formal education, many of them. They'd been to college. James Madison went to Princeton, but Princeton then was not Princeton now. And the idea that they could bring to bear this level of ability and intelligence really is pretty extraordinary. I would also say there was an element of healthy competition in what made the Constitutional Convention possible in that respect, because early on, Virginia announced who its delegates would be once Congress called this convention. And they were James Madison and George Mason and George Washington. And the other states looked at that and said, oh my God, well, we've got to send our best people, otherwise we're going to get crushed. And so they did. And the convention really was an amazing collection of not only political talent, though there was a lot of that. Several states sent their sitting governors to participate. But there was also an amazing collection of intellectual capacity there. And it is incredible. I mean, the Federalist Papers, the Federalist Papers were written as newspaper columns. They were published in the newspapers serially. And so there were weeks when Madison or Hamilton would write 3 or 4 of them in a week. And these are durable works of political philosophy. It's an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you teach, right? Or you have a PhD in this. I mean, you would your students would read the Federalist Papers as part of your reading list.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the idea that this was a newspaper column, that, Hamilton wrote these things while he was a working lawyer, a very, very busy one. It really is extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah, I read Chernow's biography of Hamilton. What a character. I mean, what a genius, but also what a character. Also had some character flaws. That whole story about how he fell for that woman and that couple were scamming or whatever. Anyway, remember the story about JFK hosting the dinner at the White House for Nobel Prize winners, and he said, It's the greatest collection of mine since Thomas Jefferson dined here alone. I mean, slightly exaggerated, but not by that much.
Yeah, these were really impressive intellects. No way around it.
All right, here's what Madison writes in Federalist Paper number 51. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Man, that is just a huge statement on human nature.
It's just extraordinary and so compact. So much is packed into a few sentences there. I think there's really a whole worldview in it, a kind of classical liberal worldview that takes a middling notion of human nature, has some high expectations of what people can do, but also low expectations of the moral constraints we have. And I think that view is very much at the center of the American constitutional system. The challenge the Constitution took on itself was to balance the imperative for majority rule, which is the only source of legitimate use of power we know of, with the imperative for the protection of rights of individuals and rights of minorities. And obviously, majority rule and minority rights are in great tension with each other. They're often at opposite ends. And the Constitution set out to ensure both of these simultaneously. It's why the system is so complex and intricate, but also why it's so incredibly impressive.
Right. So you set out a set of rules of how we're going to govern. There's the problem of the tyranny of the majority. So we have to have restraints. It's really kind of a tension between utilitarian ethics, greatest good for the greatest number. But on the other hand, sometimes the greatest number do things that are not good for the smaller number of people.
Yeah.
And so we have to say, no matter how many of you want to do X, you can't do that. And that's the Bill of Rights. And
Yeah,
later
part of this
amendments.
balance is really, I think, a function of the peculiar historical moment that they were living in, where they had been through a revolution, a break with the English that was motivated by a sense that government can be tyrannical. Their rights had been abused by a tyrannical government. And then, after the end of the war, which ended in 1783, they lived through another 5 years in which government was too weak. The state governments were completely ineffective. They were excessively democratic. They had elections every year. The states were run by their legislatures. The governors had very little power. And so they had learned in the course of 10 years both that government can be too strong and that government can be too weak. And I think that that kind of balance is what's implicit in our Constitution, the sense that we need an effective government, but we also need the protection of individual rights. I don't know that there is another moment in our history when that system could have been produced in that way, because to have both those lessons present themselves so forcefully to you, one right after the other, really creates a kind of readiness for balance that I think would have been very hard to achieve at any other time. If you put the First Amendment up for a vote at any point in American history, including today, I don't have a lot of confidence that it would pass, but I'm very glad it's there.
Freedom of speech, except for the stuff I don't like.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I have right here on my desk the little Declaration of Independence and the Constitution here. Again, we hold these truths to be just the writing. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator, and so on and so forth. But then, they have to lay out what their grievances are. And he says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, convinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. And here's a list of the things we're pissed off about. And then the rest of it is just, a laundry
It's amazing.
list.
I mean, again, you think about the moment in which they had to produce that and the incredible quality of thinking and writing that is evinced there. Now, look, the Declaration was produced by probably the best committee there's ever been. It was Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. That's a pretty good committee. But nonetheless, they had very little time, and they had to present their case. And I think what's interesting when you read the Declaration, as you just did, is that it's not just a set of principles that then says, because of these principles, we have to overthrow the British. The principles are laid out, but then they say we have to be prudent too. You can't just act radically on your principles in politics. We need to prove to you, the reader, that things have gotten bad enough that they justify this extreme response. And most of the Declaration is then a list of grievances, a list of ways that the rights of the Americans have been violated. I think that balance is evident in the Constitution, too, the sense that there's a necessity for stability, for prudence, but that ultimately government also has to answer to some core principles, what we would think of as classical liberal principles. And that's been the strength of our regime.
And so the foundation of your political position of conservatism, you would start with Edmund Burke and his statement on contrasting the American Revolution with the French Revolution.
Yeah.
That you can't just overthrow all past institutions and start from fresh, including a new calendar and a new metric system and so on.
Right.
Some things have been tried and they work pretty well. We should keep those.
Yeah, I would say the beginning is in some sense even deeper than that in Burke. I think that some of the core differences between left and right have to do with a sense of our understanding of the nature of the human person. And if you think the human person begins fallen, imperfect, unready for freedom, and has to be formed for freedom, as I do, then you think that the institutions that form us for freedom need to be conserved. That's the sense in which I'm a conservative. Those institutions are the family and culture and religion and the political institutions, educational institutions, the core institutions of society ultimately prepare us to be free people. And those do have to be conserved from generation to generation. And a lot of what politics is for the conservation of those that then allows us to make progress in the world. If you begin from a view that the human person is just born free and ready for freedom, then you tend to see the institutions of society as oppressive of that person. And the purpose of politics is to liberate people from oppressive institutions. Now, it has to be said, both these views are true sometimes, and there is truth to both of them. It's why our politics always exists as a kind of tension between the progressive and the conservative. There is a need for both. A society that only had one really would be dangerously imbalanced, but I think it's very important to see that political progress requires a certain kind of stability, a certain kind of commitment to the strength of existing institutions so that we can build on them and improve our lives.
Yeah, so the founders really had a theory of human nature on which they were building. And I guess left and right differ slightly on this. Thomas Sowell made a distinction between what he called the tragic worldview of human nature and the utopian worldview. The utopian is more the left. You know, we can mold people to be anything. They're blank slates. And therefore, if there are any inequalities or any negative things in society, it can only be the result of, bad policy. So we just need to correct the policy. On the other hand, if we have our fallen, sinful, whatever, we have restrictions, then you have to take that into account. You can only legislate so much from the top down human behavior.
It's worth seeing how these two views criticize each other. So the critique the left would have of the right is that conservative view can be just too tolerant of injustice, can tend to look at things that are plainly wrong and say, well, let's be patient, let's see what we can do with this, and therefore just tolerate oppression. The critique that the right makes of the left is that its view is not sufficiently impressed with the difficulty of sustaining social order, with how hard it is to have basic social peace, and therefore that we should hang on to those institutions that have made that possible. And when you look at our politics now, at any time really since the 18th century, these two sides tend to look at political questions in ways that are informed by those critiques. The right tends to look at questions and think in terms of order and disorder, chaos and barbarism on the one side, and civilization and social order on the other side. And politics is a struggle between those two. The left tends to look at politics as oppressor and oppressed. There is a strong and a weak, and we need to side with the weak and defend them from the strong. So they can look at the same issue. Think about immigration, for example. The right looks at that and sees a kind of invasion, the danger of chaos breaking into our orderly society. The left looks at that and sees oppressed people and oppressors and sides with the oppressed. Or order in the cities, policing in the cities. The right looks at the police and says, these are the people who are protecting social order. The left sees one has a gun and the other doesn't, and I need to make sure that there's not an abuse of power here. There is truth in both those views. I'm a conservative because I think that it's absolutely true that social order is very precious and very, very fragile. And so it is really essential that we attend to it. But it's hard to deny that there are times when that has meant in our history that we have been too tolerant of injustice and oppression. The left does have a point sometimes, just as the right, I think, does a lot of the time. It's necessary for us to see the arguments in these terms because very often these two sides talk past each other. They're not arguing about the same thing. They're advancing different views of what the nature of the problems we face really are. And in order to make any sense of that as a voter or as a person who thinks about where they belong politically, you've got to see the strength of each side, even as you see the weakness of both.
Yeah. So Lincoln's reference to our better angels has to be tempered with our inner demons that are also there.
That's right.
And so the tension here, well, let me read another quote from Madison, which he's Federalist number 10, the problem with factions. And maybe you'll want to explain what he meant by factions then. But he says, a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit no cure for the mischiefs of faction. A common passion or interest will be felt by a majority, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party. Hence it is that democracies have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths.
Yeah. I mean, part of what he's pointing to there is the simple fact that majority rule can be very dangerous, that majorities can trample the rights of minorities, and therefore that a system that relies on pure and simple majority power runs tremendous risks of allowing out-of-control majorities to not only abuse minorities, but ultimately destroy the entire order of society. And part of what he's trying to look for is a way to contain that, to constrain that, in a system that nonetheless is ultimately answerable to the public. And part of Madison's very creative answer there in Federalist 10 is that that can be achieved by extending the scope of the society, and so growing the number of factions. In a sense, Madison's point is that in a society that is bigger and broader, and not just a tiny little city-state, as republics tended to be, you'll have a diversity of views that means there isn't a permanent majority, that no one is always in the majority. And therefore, everyone is more likely to be attentive to the rights of minorities because they think, I'm going to be in the minority. I lose elections, and sometimes I win elections. That means I have to care about both sides of this equation. And that gives people a reason to take some account of constraints on majority power. And it gives us some hope that no majority will be so powerful that it can simply dominate and obliterate the rights of minorities. I think it's a view that has mostly been corroborated by American history. That is, that the scope of our republic very often has allowed us to have a sufficient diversity of views that there isn't simply the oppression of the few by the many. There have been some exceptions to that, and we also have some elements of our Constitution that are much more simply counter-majoritarian. There are rights. There are things that even a very, very large majority couldn't just do to anybody. But mostly, we've relied on the kinds of protections that Madison points to, and I think mostly they've held strong. Obviously, not always.
Yeah. That makes me wonder if, parenthetically, talking about this recent spike in anti-Semitism and the bizarre support of Hamas by the left and liberals over the support of Israel, which, they've always supported the Jews. Is it because of this worldview reference of oppressed and oppressor, and Israel is a successful, powerful nation, therefore it has to be an oppressor, therefore we should support Hamas? And
I really think that's right, that there is an inherent suspicion of power and a sense that when you look at Israel and the Palestinians, Israel seems more powerful, and therefore it must be the less just. I think it's a very simple-minded way to think about politics, and ultimately a mistaken way to think about this particular situation. But yeah, I think the frame of oppressor and oppressed leaves people looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an example of the powerful abusing the weak, when if you actually look at the situation, I mean, who started this war, and why haven't they been able to reach a resolution for so many years? It's just not nearly so simple a story as saying Israel is stronger and therefore we should side with the Palestinians.
Yeah, so bizarre. Well, hopefully that'll change. But on this, like going back in time, I was just going to ask you if you could time travel back with the founding fathers and sit there with Madison and go through these things and go, okay, I now have the benefit of almost 250 years here to see what actually happened. Here's where you got it right so many places, but right there and that there, if you tweak this a little bit, what would you advise that they change a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, I think what they didn't see above all was that the deal they made, the kind of dark bargain they made, put aside the question of slavery, would be untenable and unsustainable. And the greatest failure of the constitutional system was the Civil War, which was necessitated by the fact that they left the question of slavery up to the states. And ultimately that meant that we ended up with a country that was divided in half. And the division was over the very principle that had defined the American nation from the beginning. The commitment to the equality of all people was rejected by half the country in practice, and that was not sustainable. You can see, I think, why they did it. It would have been very hard to ratify the Constitution if they'd insisted on some resolution of the slavery debate. But at the same time, by assigning it to the states, they put the question of state and federal power in a way that was intertwined with the question of slavery and created tremendous problems, many of which we're still living with now. I don't know that I have a solution to offer them if I were to go back to 1787 and say this isn't the right way to resolve this problem. But I would certainly hope that they might have seen that on that front, what they created really was untenable, and we had a fundamental failure of the constitutional system over that question. I think the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, um, offer a partial resolution of that problem and are redemptive of the original deal. With them, the Constitution really does live up to the principles of the American founding. But it was incomplete until that moment, no doubt about it.
Yeah. On a question about slavery, since you mentioned that, how could they not know that slavery was wrong? I mean, it's not fair for us to judge them now, but on the other hand, if you have to lock somebody up and use chains and violence to keep them in place, on some level of your brain, don't you have to think, I don't think they actually want to be slaves. As Lincoln said, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a slave owner. It's so basic. It's, the principle of interchangeable perspectives, as Steve Pinker calls it, or just the golden rule. I mean, as old as civilization. Yeah. I don't know. How do you think about that?
I think the human capacity to avert our eyes from evil is very powerful. And I'm sure there will be things about how we live now that some future generations will look on and think, how could they have done that and not seen? I hope that there's nothing so grave and brazen as slavery. And obviously there were many people then who did see it and who understood it. And some of them were very intertwined with slavery. James Madison, who did own slaves, he inherited them from his father, and he retained them and was a slave owner for his entire adult life. Nonetheless understood that slavery was an evil institution. He wanted to keep it out of the Constitution. He wanted to avoid describing it in the Constitution in a way that would suggest, as he put it, that man can have property in man. He saw that that was not right. And yet, in his own life, he persisted in doing it. I think we should be able, from the distance we have, to reject that as a moral failure, and yet still be willing to accept as a great gift a lot of what Madison offers us and ended up producing for us. It's not wrong to judge them. I think what they did on this question really was deeply immoral and unjust, and we have to be able to see that. But we also have to recognize that part of what that means to us is that human beings are highly imperfect, and that there are probably things we're doing that if we really looked at them carefully, we would recognize that we ought not do, and we work hard not to look at them carefully. That's in the nature of the human person, too.
Yeah. Since I have you, I want to ask you, just maybe kind of wrap things up here a little bit, on this deeper issue of to what extent facts and values, or rationality, can lead us to real objective moral values. Here, let me just read from an unpublished note penned in 1854 by Abraham Lincoln. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. Is it color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care, because by this rule you are to be slave to the first man you meet who has fairer skin than your own. You don't mean color exactly. You mean that whites are intellectually the superior of the blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them? Take care again, by this rule you are to be the slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But, say you, it is a question of interest, and if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well, and if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. And then he said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a slave master. That seems like a pretty good argument for just basic reasoning and reasoning your way to a conclusion. You don't need, any supernatural ethics or biblical ethics. Just what do people want by human nature?
Yeah. Well, I think that's right up to a point. I would say that at the core, at the bottom of that argument, there is the notion that in some fundamental way, all human beings are equal. We are equally human, and therefore equally deserving of being treated with some basic dignity and being granted freedom from coercion. That argument is, I think, rooted in an assertion The Declaration of Independence very brashly describes it as self-evident.
Yeah.
And I love that, but I'm not actually sure what it means.
No, it was never
to say that
self-evident
anything
before
is
that.
self-evident. Yeah. Lincoln, to his great credit, in the Gettysburg Address, he doesn't describe it as self-evident. He says that our nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A proposition is a claim that demands proof.
Yeah.
And the proof of that proposition, I think, does invite us to reach very, very deep to the bottom to the moral foundations of our way of understanding ourselves. To my mind, I do think that there is ultimately a reason to rely on a fundamental assertion of human dignity, on the notion that we are all created equal, which really means created equally in the image of God. Now, I don't think you have to be a religious person exactly to have that view of the human person, but created equal does say created. And I do think that it's actually pretty hard to make that argument without some verb like that assumes something outside of our moral framework, or rather our rational framework. I certainly think that it's important for us to make rational arguments for core human morality, and arguments that don't require that we all share a religious outlook, that we all have the same religious beliefs, because that's not going to happen. We all have to treat each other equally, even though we're not going to think identically. But at the end of the day, I think that assertion in particular, the assertion of human equality, invites us to look beyond simply the rational framework. And I'm not sure how that's done in purely rational terms. It's possible, I hope so, but I would say I've never been fully persuaded that we can do that.
Yeah. Well, here's one way. Let me just read a couple passages from my next book on this, in which I'm quoting here Steven Pinker. This is from his Enlightenment Now book. It might have been Rationality. In any case, he equates some moral values with Platonic truths that can be discovered. On this analogy, we are born with a rudimentary concept of number, but as soon as we build on it with formal mathematical reasoning, the nature of mathematical reality forces us to discover some truths and not others. No one who understands the concept of 2, the concept of 4, and the concept of addition can come to any conclusion but that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Perhaps we're born with a rudimentary moral sense, and as soon as we build on it with moral reasoning, the nature of moral reality forces us to some conclusions but not others. And then he gives an example of this. If I appeal to you to do anything that affects me, to get off my foot, or tell me the time, or not run me over with your car, then I can't do it in a way that privileges my interest over yours, say retaining my right to run you over with my car if I want you to take me seriously. Unless I'm a galactic overlord, I have to state my case in a way that would force me to treat you in kind. I can't act as if my interests are special just because I'm me and you're not, any more than I can persuade you that the spot I'm standing on is a special place in the universe just because I happen to be standing on it. Right, so then he calls that the principle of interchangeable perspectives. It's the golden rule, really.
Yeah. Well, it is the golden rule, but it presumes equality. It does not prove it. It does not argue for
it. All right, so there's a built-in assumption you're saying there.
Yeah,
from
and
the
I do
very
think
beginning.
that ultimately there has to be, the word perhaps does a lot of work in that quote. And perhaps, but I think that ultimately if we want to root our morality in a solid place, I have not seen a proof like this that I find persuasive. I do believe in human equality, but that's because I believe in a number of other things that ultimately are not simply arrived at by argument, but are a function of the traditions that I've grown up in. I'm a Jewish person, and I take seriously the claim that we are created equally in the image of God, and that in relation to Him we are equal. I'm sure that's not the only way to arrive at that view, but I'm not sure that there is a fully coherent way to do it within the logical framework that Steven Pinker is offering. I hope so, but I don't think I've seen that.
Okay, let's play with this a little bit more. So that there's that quote from Bentham, rights is nonsense, and what natural rights is nonsense on stilts. So even a natural rights argument still has some bottom to it that has to be filled. What about just like the study of human nature? What do people really want? So here's an example. Would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? Well, we know the answer. Would you rather live in East Germany or West Germany for the unification? We know the answer. Why is that? why do people want to be free rather than enslaved, or healthy rather than diseased, or satiated rather than hungry? I mean, there's certain aspects back to human nature. It's just the way we are. We're just born that way, whether it's created by God or we're just evolution gave us this motivation to want one thing over another. Maybe that's as foundational as we can get.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it also points toward a kind of Aristotelian virtue ethics that begins from the observation of our nature, which I think is a real thing. I mean, that's a core reality. We don't fully understand it, and so it's not simply subject to logical argument, but it is up to a point, up to a pretty far point, and it's possible to make persuasive arguments about it. So that way of reasoning, I think, is persuasive.
Yeah. Now, where I start to run out of runway here is on more of the edge issues, like, say, abortion.
Yes.
The rights of the fetus to live, the rights of the mother to choose. Well, Thomas Sowell always says, there are no solutions, just compromises. Or trans rights. Trans rights are human rights. Yeah, I don't think trans people should be discriminated against or fired arbitrarily or whatever. But I also want to protect the rights of women to be exclusively in their own sports and locker rooms and bathrooms, and I don't want guys going in there. I don't care how they identify. You can't have everything. Most of what the stuff you're talking about in your book is really conflicting rights. You can't have everything.
I think that's right, and a lot of these really ought to be resolved by some process of negotiation and compromise and bargaining. Not everything can work out that way, but we should want as much as possible to be resolvable that way, to be tractable in that way, because the alternatives are very difficult, and some of them are very unjust. And wherever it's possible, we should want to avoid that and prefer a legitimate outcome where people feel they're represented, they've been heard, and the outcome somehow takes them seriously, even if it's not exactly what they wanted.
Yeah. Okay, just back to your book to conclude here. So you're talking about Congress and the judicial system, the courts, the Supreme Court, president, all this stuff. And you wrote all this before the recent meltdowns and problems. But, going forward, how would you tweak the system? I mean, like term limits in Congress or the Supreme Court?
I'm not inclined to term limits. I think if you look at Congress, it's not really the people who've been there longest who are the biggest problem. I do think, though, that we have to think about the incentives that politicians face. And some of the problems we confront are certainly a function of those incentives. I think Madison's psychology is right. He says people in politics are ambitious, and so they're going to do what it takes to succeed. And therefore, it really matters what it takes to succeed. And that is up to the structure of the system. I think we have allowed the system now to become deformed in such a way that what it takes to succeed is to be an effective performer in the circus of our culture wars. And a lot of members of Congress think to succeed, I need to build my own brand. I need to have a big following on social media. I need to be a prominent figure on cable news. And therefore, that's what they do. If they understood what it took to succeed as, I need to prove to my voters that I'm bringing some benefits back home, I need to be an effective legislator, I need to be good at solving public problems, then they'd be more likely to invest their significant talents in that kind of work, in traditional legislative work. So we have to think, why do they face these incentives and not those? And that does have to do with some mundane things like the structure of the primary system. And I propose in the book some ways to experiment with reforms of that system, like ranked choice voting in primaries, which I think could be useful. And the structure of the work of the Congress itself. I think we need to allow much more power to flow through the congressional committees, for example, rather than centralizing it all in leaders, so that members feel like the work they do in negotiating with one another over public policy could actually matter. They could actually claim ownership of some achievement on behalf of their constituents. Right now, they mostly can't do that. These people aren't stupid. They're not behaving like this because they think it's great. They're behaving like this in a lot of times because this is the only way to show themselves capable and strong and effective and successful. And we need to give them other ways of doing that. So in a funny way, the book begins from very broad political theory arguments, but concludes in some fairly mundane kinds of institutional reforms, because I think those things are very related. And culture is ultimately a product of incentives, which are a product of institutional rules.
So voter ID would be a reasonable...
I certainly think voter ID is a good idea, yeah. Absolutely.
What's the liberal counter to that? What could they possibly argue? That just
I
seems
think
obvious.
that again, it is an oppressor and oppressed argument. It's an argument that says you're just using the power you have to exclude people who aren't in a position to be able to have the kinds of privileges you've got. Now, I think that's just wrong. I mean, it's not hard to get identification in America, and it doesn't cost anything. So I don't really think that that's a fair argument. Now, obviously, some of the argument is also self-interested. People who are less likely to have ID historically have been more likely to vote for Democrats in the last half century or so, and that's not entirely separable from the argument they make. It's not entirely separable from the Republican arguments for making it harder to vote. I think it should be easy to vote, but that you should have to prove that you're eligible, and those things can both be done at the same time.
It seems pretty obvious why we should do that, but okay, money in politics, lobbyists, and all that stuff. Would you reform any of that?
I've become less impressed with the power of money in politics over the last 10, 15 years. I think that we attribute too much to it. I'm not opposed to controls on it, and I think that it makes some sense to have constraints on what people can spend. I think more of the money should flow through the parties rather than around the parties, and some of our campaign finance reforms have been misguided in that way, and that they've disempowered the political parties, and as a result have empowered outside groups who are not really accountable to anybody. That's been a mistake in my view, and I think there are ways to reform that. But I don't think reforms of money in politics would have a massive effect. I think the same way about gerrymandering. People say, gerrymandered districts create some of our polarization. I think if you look at the House and Senate, they're pretty similar in how polarized they are. There's no gerrymandering in the Senate. Senators are elected by entire states. So again, maybe there's a cause for doing something about the most extreme examples, but we shouldn't expect that would dramatically transform how our politics works. The place to make changes is in the core incentives for behavior that confront our politicians. And I think those are about the primaries and the structure of legislative work.
Okay, very good, Yuval. Here's the book again, American Covenant. We need unification. Yes, learning how to disagree is probably the most important thing we could do at this point. That's hard.
Yeah.
Well, that's the nature of the experiment. All right, thanks for your work. You're one of my favorite.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Writers. What are you working on next, or are you just going to wait and see?
Well,
how
I just
things
finished
unfold?
this book, so I'm mostly talking about the Constitution for a while, and then I'll find my way toward the next big project.
You should piece together a bunch of your pieces into an essay collection.
Yeah, that could be good.